and welcome to Misconceptions, a program that is committed to rightly dividing the word of truth. I'm your host, Rommel Hussain, and today we have with us Dr. Mark Harwood from CMI Creation Ministries International. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. It's always a pleasure to have you come here and discuss these real relevant subjects, especially when we're talking about science and the Bible. And I'm quite thrilled because you've been answering all of our tough questions so far. I'm trying to stump you here, but I haven't been very successful. So what I'd like to speak about today is specifically the fossil record. Now, this is something that comes up from time to time, especially when you're dealing with the creationist view and evolutionist view. Now, in one of the previous episodes, we were able to look at how the global flood, the Noah flood, as per Genesis chapter 7, how that must have caused real rapid devastation.
Yes,
absolutely. But however, that seems to be contradictory with what an evolutionist says. So how do you explain that in terms of the fossil record?
Well, I think key to this, understanding this, is the way people look at the evidence. So we all have the same evidence, the same fossils and so on. So the evolutionists will look at the evidence with a mindset, or if you like, a pair of glasses, that has already predetermined that the fossils are of vast age. So he looks at the fossils and he sees millions and millions of years. A creationist, however, or someone who believes that the Bible's history in Genesis is true, will look at the evidence with a very different set of glasses. They will interpret the evidence in the light of the Bible's history. So I, for instance, would look at the fossil record and see evidence for thousands of years, because the Bible tells us that the flood of Noah was about 4,500 years ago. So the difference is like this, and let's say we've found a fossil bone. You know, when paleontologists dig up fossil bones, they don't come with little tags attached to them saying how old they are. So when the paleontologist examines the evidence, that's what you might call operational science. That's based on observable, repeatable experiments. You can actually do measurements on the bone, you can look at its physical and chemical composition and so on. But the age of the bone is an interpretation of the data. So when you look at the age tag, you're in fact doing what you could call historical science. That is, you're interpreting the data in accordance with what you believe about the history of the events that have taken place. So when the evolutionist looks at the fossils, for instance, he sees processes that are long and slow and gradual, and that's how he interprets the evidence. So if you take a look at this particular example, a beautifully preserved fossil fish. Now, the usual story that we hear in our biology textbooks and so on about the formation of a fossil fish goes something like this. The little fish is swimming along in a river or a lake or whatever, and it dies, sinks to the bottom, some sediment is swept over it, it covers it, sets as hard as rock, and that becomes a fossil. And over time there's some uplift and then some erosion, and then somebody finds a fossil. But we can do some real observable science on that. For instance, I don't know if you've ever kept goldfish, but I used to, and I tell you now that when the fish died, they didn't sink to the bottom, they floated to the top.
That's right.
And almost always in nature, that's what happens. And if the fish then floats to the top, other fish will come and eat it, or birds will pick at it, and before long there's just a few bony remains that will sink to the bottom. And so you can do some real science, some observable experiments. Next time you go snorkeling or scuba diving, you look down at the ocean floor. Can you see all those dead fish lying there waiting to become fossils? Well, of course you don't, do you? So, in fact, what you need to form a fossil is some special conditions, and one of those is rapid burial. Now, here's a fascinating fossil. This is a marine creature called an ichthyosaur, and this is an example of rapid burial. Now, this particular ichthyosaur is a female ichthyosaur, and I can tell that because it's in the very act of giving birth. You can see the baby ichthyosaur there just emerging from the mother's birth canal. Now, I've heard of long labours, but that didn't take place over thousands of years. You see, what happened there was a rapid, catastrophic process. That creature was dumped on by tons of mud and sediment, and there it is preserved in the fossil record.
So even millions of years, you know, I mean, you mentioned thousands of years, it certainly wouldn't have taken over millions of years to be able to produce that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And look at this little guy, he didn't even get time to finish eating breakfast.
That's right.
You see now, that shows evidence, clear evidence of rapid burial. So one of the special conditions you need to form a fossil is rapid burial in such a way that no oxygen can get to the body of the animal to then rot it away. So the mere fact that fossils actually exist is, if you like, it's consistent with what the Genesis account of history tells us.
So if you, for this thing to take place, so for the burial of these creatures, which we call fossils, to take place, you're saying that one of the main things is that it needs to happen in a very fast-paced type of way. It needs to be a rapid thing.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
Does this sit well with what the evolutionist says?
Well, it does, because the evolutionists recognise that even the process of fossilisation, once the creature is buried, can be quite rapid. Here's an interesting quotation from Dr. Curry, who is a dinosaur expert. And he says this: "Fossilisation is a process that can take place anything from a few hours to millions of years." Now, if you're a scientist doing observations, which of those two extremes would you have actually observed? Obviously not the millions of years. And he goes on and says, "The amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralised is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly." And we've got some interesting examples of rapid fossil formation. But you know, Darwin himself believed that the process of fossilisation was a very slow one. And in his book, The Origin of Species, he said that no organism wholly soft can be preserved. And yet we find things like this: a beautifully preserved jellyfish.
Wow.
A fossilised jellyfish. So clearly, soft-bodied creatures can be fossilised, but that also speaks of rapid processes. And there's some excellent modern examples. Here's a hat, for instance, which was left in a mine for over 50 years, and here it is fossilised. And this ring of rock was found on a beach in Western Australia. And people wondered what on earth it was. They cut it open and discovered it was actually a roll of number 8 fencing wire that somebody had left there. And over the years, it had become fossilised, encrusted like that, and there it is as a rock. So these things can, in fact, happen quite rapidly.
It's amazing. I mean, if you look at that fossil fencing wire, you would never guess that by simply looking at it. But we had the advantage of being able to cut it open, and we know, because we've got that around now, we know exactly what it was.
That's right. That's right.
So now, does the fossil record itself, does it point to or is it consistent with the biblical account as being true?
Well, I think it is, and there are a number of other ways in which it bears consistency with the Bible's record. And one of them is a mechanism or a process called stasis. And what this means is that creatures that are living today are also found in exactly the same body plan and form in the fossil record. For instance, here is an ant found preserved in amber. The amber is supposed to be between 15 and 20 million years old, and the ant is identical to one which was recently found alive and well in South America. So there has been no evolutionary change over all those millions and millions of years. Now, if time and minor variations and what have you acted on by natural selection is what you need for evolution, then why do we find things that have not changed over that period of time? Here's another example. This was a fish called a coelacanth, believed to have been extinct for some hundreds of millions of years until someone fished one up in the Indian Ocean, alive and well, and exactly the same body plan and skeleton and so on. Another example of stasis. It's not only animals and creatures too. Here's a Wallamai pine. This was a tree that was found west of Sydney in the Blue Mountains, and the people who found it were very excited. They said, it's just like finding a live dinosaur. This was supposed to be 200 million years old, and yet here it was, still growing and exactly consistent with the remains found in the fossil record.
Now, when we look at the fossil record itself, we understand that these things point back to how or when these things lived. Now, we would expect to see, as per the evolutionists would teach us, and I've seen this in school textbooks, is that you would find the bottom order of things, or the simple forms of life, such as marine life, to be on the bottom of the level. If you could imagine just a type of chain or a level, and the bottom end of the sediments would show the marine life. And as you go higher, you would find the more complex life forms sitting on a top end order of things. Now, do you find that to be consistent with what the Bible teaches? Is that consistent with the creationist worldview?
Well, this is an example, I guess, of how someone will interpret the evidence in accordance with the glasses that they're wearing, their worldview, if you like. And you're right, evolutionists say, look at the order of things in the fossil record, that surely proves evolution. You have simple organisms at the bottom and more complex ones at the top. But if you think about the mechanism and what actually would have happened at the time of the flood, it actually makes a lot more sense to see how it fits in with the Bible's record of history. And let me explain what I mean. You see, the fossil record is actually evidence of the order in which things were buried, naturally, but people interpret it as the order in which things lived.
Okay.
Now, if you think about it, with a flood ensuing and rising floodwaters and sediments being deposited, then the very first things which are likely to be trapped and buried will be marine creatures. And so you'd expect to find molluscs and so on at the lower levels that would be buried in the lower levels of sediment. As I often say to people, clams don't run very fast. But then animals which are more capable of escaping, higher order animals, mammals and vertebrates and so on, they could scramble to higher ground, to safety. They could perhaps float, they could cling to floating mats of vegetation or whatever and survive longer. So you would expect that the more agile animals would be buried last, or maybe even not buried at all if they simply drowned and their bodies then rotted. And then we read in the Bible that at the end of the flood, the mountains rose up and the valleys sank down. So the first thing that happens is the waters flow off the continents. They rush off in vast sheets of water flowing back into the oceans. So the first layers which are going to be eroded by that are, of course, the most recently laid ones. And they will be the ones which contain whatever of the higher order animals were in fact buried. So what we find in the fossil record is that more than 95% of it is actually marine. A very small proportion is the fossil remains of animals. And once again, exactly consistent with what you would expect to find given the accuracy of the historical record of the Bible.
Now, is there a website in which people are able to check these things out for themselves, do a little bit more research?
There certainly is, Rommel, and I'd invite people to go to creation.com, appearing on your screen right now. And if you go in there, there's a search window on our website, and you can type in questions that you might have about any aspects that we've discussed on these programs. And that website has available to you some 7,000 different articles and items of interest, not all aimed at a very scientific level. A lot of them are just at lay level. But if you really want to dig deep, then there are scientifically solid articles in there as well, explaining in more detail these sorts of issues that we've been discussing.
So is the fossil record, in terms of an early history, you know, this happening over a rapid period of time, and it's not quite that old, you know, just thousands of years ago, is this being taught anywhere? I mean, in our schools, universities, and so forth?
Not in the secular system.
Okay.
The secular education system, of course, continues to promulgate the long age, the vast age belief system of evolution. And the reason for that is, of course, that if you don't have all the millions and millions of years, then you don't have time for all of these supposed transitions to slowly take place from a simple organism to a complex one. And if the vast periods of time are not true, then the only option that you have for explaining and understanding the diversity of life all around us is that it was all created. But the evolutionary story requires that you have vast periods of time and that natural processes account for everything that we can see around us.
Why aren't they willing to accept the biblical account?
Why aren't they?
Yes.
Oh, well, because the biblical account will, of course, lead you directly to a creator God. And people don't want there to be a creator God, because if there is a creator God, then perhaps I'm going to be called to account for how I've lived my life. And people, you know, would prefer to not be held to account, to be able to make their own decisions, live their own life, and so on. That's why this whole idea of this, this evolutionary slow development, you see, is so important to our secular way of thinking. But it's interesting, you know, even Darwin recognised that the evidence in the fossil record did not support his views.
Really? How's that?
Well, in his book, The Origin of Species, he said this: "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory." Now, in his time, in the middle 1800s, he published The Origins in 1859. The fossil record was obviously far less than what we have today. But 150 years later, it's interesting to see what we have. This gentleman, Dr. Colin Patterson, was a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. He wrote a book about fossils, and someone wrote to him about that book, and he wrote back and said this: "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument."
Wow.
So that's a pretty revealing statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
150 years later, you see the fossil record still does not support the slow, gradual story that we're taught in our education system, the evolutionary story. Because what you'd expect to find, to be able to go from one organism to another, there must be all these intermediate stages of development as the organism slowly changes. Like, for instance, if it was going to develop wings, or where there were no wings, or legs where there were no legs, then you'd expect to find various stages of these organs forming and finally coming into full development. But that's not what we find in the fossil record. We find creatures fully developed and no transitional forms, or at the very best, there's maybe a handful of disputed examples. But instead of that, there should be millions upon millions upon millions of them. But they're not in the fossil record.
What about these cladograms that are often shown to us, you know, pointing to, you know, the ancestry of fossil records, which point to the evolutionist, you know, worldview or point of view?
Yeah, well, a cladogram is a way of arranging the evidence. There's a few famous examples of this. For instance, there was one showing the supposed evolution of the horse. And it started off with a little horse, and it got larger ones, and
maybe a pony, and
and then finally a big one at the end, and so on. That, by the way, has been long since discredited, so I'm hopeful that it doesn't still appear in biology textbooks. But I could arrange things. For instance, I could start off with a unicycle, and then I could put next to it a bicycle, and then I could have a tricycle, and then perhaps I could have four wheels with an engine, and I could call it a car. And then I could put a tray on the back, and I could have a small truck, and then I could have a semi-trailer, and finally a B-double. But a B-double hasn't evolved from a unicycle.
No, certainly not.
It's just a method of arranging the component parts. And this is the sort of thing that we see quite often. Here's an example of a cladogram. This purports to show macroevolution, as they call it, large-scale evolution, the origin of tetrapods, and they're sort of four-footed animals, having originated apparently from fish. Now, it's interesting, when you look at that diagram, you see the fossil evidence there of all the different creatures, but the fossils are actually at the edge of the evolutionary tree, if you like the leaves, the outer edge, the periphery of the tree. But it's in the so-called junctions of the branches and the boughs and the branches to the trunks, where there is no fossil evidence. The rest of the cladogram is pure imagination, but it implies that it's all been well documented and well understood. So Darwin came up with this concept of the evolutionary tree of life, but in fact when you look at the data, the tree really just fades away. All we have in reality are the fully formed creatures at the outer edges of the tree and none of the interlinking component parts that make up the tree. So the evidence for the evolutionary tree of life is actually not there.
Now, is this an important thing? I mean, I would like to sort of start to wind things down a little bit because we are starting to run out of time, but there are so many Christians that are out there which really have no interest in this stuff. All they want to know is the Bible, and the Bible is everything, and anything external to that, well, it's not important. Is that a part of the dilemma in which, you know, we are in now, where we see this rise of, you know, evolutionist viewpoint and worldview being taught and so rampant, and it seems to be dominating, you know, any type of Christianity or religious belief in a creator God?
Well, it certainly is dominant in our culture, isn't it, this whole idea of evolution. A lot of Christians don't know what to do with it, partly because they don't understand why it's important, and then they feel intimidated by the scientific community. But let me explain why this is really important. You see, when you look at the rocks, people interpret them as being millions and millions of years, and we've already talked about how the millions of years are actually not in the rocks in previous sessions. But when they look at the rocks and they see the fossils that are buried within them, they interpret those fossils as depicting death and struggle and suffering for millions and millions of years. Now, that flies directly in the face of what the Bible teaches. So the evolutionary story has all these years of struggle and death and suffering, and finally mankind appears at the end of the scene. So that places death and suffering and all of those bad things before Adam.
Okay.
But the Bible gives us a radically different story. It says that it was Adam's actions in the garden that led to death and suffering coming into the world. And the Bible then goes on to say, because of the rebellion of the first Adam, the last Adam had to come to pay the price of our rebellion. You see, the first Adam cut himself off from the source of all life, from God. And so the only consequence was death. The penalty for our rebellion is death. And I say our because we all have the same Adamic nature as a result of our forefathers, the first man's fall, rebellion against God. And so it's a price that we can't pay. But Jesus came, God's own Son, in human form, and he gave his life for us on the cross. And he did that to pay the price for our rebellion. And that's why this is so profoundly important, because if the millions of years are true, there is no need for Jesus to have gone to the cross, because death would not have been the consequence of Adam's sin. But the Bible tells us that death is the consequence of Adam's sin. That's why Jesus went to the cross. So it forms the very basis, it's the foundation stone, if you like, of the whole of the gospel message.
I suppose this is why I often say that you'll never know why. You'll never know why these things happen the way they do, unless you be able to come back to the Bible.
Absolutely.
And the Bible it doesn't only tell us how things occurred, but it tells us why, it gives us why, and I think that's what you were just explaining there.
That's right.
And it's so important to be able to understand why these things happen. I really don't think that people are asking the why question enough.
I think you're right, and partly because we are taught right from the very beginning of our education system that evolution's a fact, the millions of years are true, and therefore by implication what the Bible says in its opening chapters must clearly be wrong.
And even more than that, like what you're talking about, Jesus Christ having to come and being the way of salvation, we're taught to accept death, to accept suffering, to accept disease. This is a cycle of life. That's right. We don't know where this cycle is going to end up. It's going to end up changing and so on and so on. And as long as you look outside of the Bible, you speculate on so many other things. But the Bible is very clear on why we die. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
It gives us the answer of why.
That's right. It's a consequence of our rebellion. But you see, that's the beauty of the salvation message that the Bible presents to us, because God hasn't left us alone in the mess. He has come as our rescuer, our saviour. And it's through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ that we can come back into relationship with God. And the Bible tells us that we will be restored again and live eternally with Him for eternity in the new heavens and the new earth.
Dr. Mark, thank you once again for being able to come on this show and answer these really difficult questions.
Thank you, Ronald.
You've really opened up my understanding to a lot of these things, and I'm sure that you would most certainly point people to that website. We'll get it to come up on the screen again, the CMI website. And the other thing is that it's so important for people to go and read the Bible. I mean, it's wonderful to have this knowledge, but you really need to go back to God's handbook for this life, God's will on things. You know, the reason why, the book that God has left us with, in which details what He wants us to do and how it is that we can have a relationship with Him through Jesus Christ. So if I can just turn to our audience now, and I'd just like to say to you that I hope we haven't offended you, but rather that we've challenged you. I pray that you have found this show to be exceptionally informative. Please stay in tune for the very next episode, and until then, may God bless you, and goodbye.